I'd like to take a moment and thank our sponsor. If you have a laser device for training and you want to take it to the next level, or if you're looking to get into using a laser device for training, check out the products at laserapp.com, LASRAPP.com. You can use code CSP2021 for 15% off the items you've selected. And thanks for checking them out. Welcome, everybody, to this week's edition of the Casual Shooters Podcast, your premier podcast for the casual shooter. This week you have me, you have Dave, and you have Leo. Maybe, if he ever says hello.
Yo!
There we go. And you have Huggy.
Hello!
What's up?
All right. This week's guest is somewhat of a celebrity, if you want to say that. He's called the Traveling RO. So let's bring in Yee-min Lin. How you doing, Yee-min?
Good, Dave. How you guys doing tonight?
Very good. Don't mind Yee. He's a little browner than normal. He's got a lot of sun today doing his dad stuff. So, Yee-min, why don't you take a second and introduce yourself?
Well, gentlemen, thanks again for having me on today and taking some time out of your weekend Saturday to listen to me talk about myself for a little bit. For those of you that are just coming onto the podcast, my name is Yee-min. I am currently living out in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, where I've been involved in USPSA since about 2014. So prior to USPSA, I grew up in Western Kentucky. I ended up going out to college in the East Coast. And then it seemed like a really good idea for me to join the Marine Corps after college. That was shortly before 9/11, so things obviously went a little bit different than expected. So I did a couple deployments to Iraq with 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines as a logistics officer. After my time in the Marine Corps, then I decided to move to stay in California. So I moved up to the San Francisco Bay Area. I was spending a little bit of time doing tactical training. Spent quite a bit of time with some folks back in the day, like Frank Proctor and a couple other folks. And then I found out about USPSA through the pistol shooting forum. So there was a guy by the name of Gabe White, and his range diary sort of got me interested in USPSA. So I found a range that was hosting matches. And then at that point, I got started and realized, wow, I'm really not very good at pistol. So I decided to kind of get really involved in that. Got my RO certification within a year. And then at the time, realized that the best way to go about shooting major matches on a budget was to work the matches. So I've been working major matches, local matches, pretty much any match I could find across the United States since about 2015. And that kind of takes us to where we are now, where allegedly I hear there's some sort of presidential election going on for the heart and soul of USPSA.
I think that's fake news.
It probably is.
It's Fauci science. All right. So, Yee-min, what we normally do is we ask a few personal questions to get to know you, kind of break the ice type of a thing, and then we move into the actual interrogation portion of the podcast. Okay. All right, Leo, you are up.
All right. So, first question, most important question, sets the tone for the rest of the podcast question. There are wrong answers to this question. No pressure. What is your favorite movie?
It's probably a toss-up between Heat and Saving Private Ryan.
Okay.
Respectable. I'm in.
Yeah.
Please elaborate.
Well, like it or not, Heat was probably one of the first movies that I saw that actually did a really excellent job with talking about actual firearms handling. So the Marine Corps has used that in officer training and basic training for years, talking about this is a really good example of fire and movement. And for something that was done in LA, that scene is something that you could watch and you could always learn something new in terms of shooting, moving, engaging essentially what is a pincer ambush. That whole scene pretty much makes the movie. And what I particularly like about Heat is the complexity of the characters. So Al Pacino's character was not necessarily this golden child, right? You know, he had issues with his family, his daughters, and a divorce, and the girlfriend they had at the time, and the other character, you know, he wasn't necessarily a straight up bad guy. You know, he had a human element to him. So that was a really interesting mix of, you know, very effective firearms handling and tactics, as well as providing a very complicated picture of, you know, just because you're the good guy or the alleged bad guy, there's more to it than just whatever these stereotypes are. Saving Private Ryan, same thing. I think that was really the first time that you got an opportunity to see a war movie in a fairly unvarnished view. So all the realism of, you know, you're getting ready to land on the beach and everybody's thinking, oh yeah, we're getting ready to storm the beaches like John Wayne, and you know, it's not really like that. Everybody's trying their hardest not to throw up over each other. I think I was fortunate enough that I spent all my time in the desert, so my experience of amphibious operations was getting in a plane, landing in Iraq, thinking it looked just like 29 Palms, but it provided a certain amount of reality, and they did a really great job with the character development. So, you know, nobody expected Tom Hanks's character to be a history school teacher, and even the corporal translator. You know, not everybody is a hero, right? You know, that guy totally froze up, but it made you want to hate him so bad. You're like, dude, all you have to do is just get up the stairs and save your buddy. But the reality is, you know, nobody really knows how they're going to react when people actually start shooting back. So, you know, I have the most interesting story I have about that is people will ask, you know, have you ever been shot at? And I was attached to a command unit as the logistics liaison. And I remember we were at the Baghdad International Airport, and so the security guys go out. I'm sitting here, and I've got this radio like plugged to my head because we ran out of radio helmets. So I'm sitting here next to, you know, a giant turbo diesel engine, and I'm sitting here trying to pay attention to what's going on the radio. And then all of a sudden, the corpsman goes, "Sir, they're shooting at us!" And I look up, and I just see tracers flying out across the door. And I say, "Well, close the door. Can't see it. We're going to be okay." And he goes, "Oh, that's a great idea." He closes the door, and we're like, "See, we're good." And you know, it's just one of those things that it's a really, and nobody would ever think like, well, if I don't see the tracers, it'll be fine. But
Yeah, you're good.
But to a certain extent, you're like, well, your job is to stay here in case anybody gets hit. I'm here trying to figure out if we need to put bullets and band-aids. If something actually hits us, we probably won't know. It'll just be like, oh, well, I'm not sitting at this Amtrak anymore. So, but you know, it was a very human take on how people react in combat, which I thought was really, really, really special.
And it wasn't just at the beginning. It went throughout the whole movie, how they were reacting, like the guy who was supposed to reload the ammo going up the stairs, you know, the fear that he had. So, yeah, it went all the way throughout the movie.
So we can continue because you passed the first, you know, barrier to entry. So we're good.
Thank God. Thank God.
Yeah, I just want to let you know. Pressure's gone down a little bit. So we're good. We're good.
Sounds good.
All right,
Thanks for the
Huggy.
question, Mayo.
All right. Well, my question for you is, what is your favorite book?
Favorite book is probably, it still remains Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers. This was, again, it was a book I had read before I joined the Marine Corps, but the book itself is, again, you read it and it's initially a science fiction movie, right? So everybody goes, wow, I wish I could have powered armor. I got like portable nukes, all sorts of things. But the story in and of itself is actually a very interesting look into civic responsibility, right? It very much talks about, you know, who has the right to vote, and you can agree or disagree on whether you sort of need to earn this. So if you kind of tie that to back to Saving Private Ryan, right? So this guy is the youngest of 5, and they send some guys out there just to rescue him. And at the very end, Tom Hanks's character looks at Matt Damon and he goes, you know, earn this, right? And that's something that weighs very heavily on Matt Damon's character for the remainder of his life, where he goes, he asked his wife, am I a good person? Did I live a good life? And so there, you know, what you define as universal service and earning the right to participate in society. It was a very interesting exploration into, you know, is is society, is democracy, is civic participation worth that much more when you have actually sacrificed for it, as opposed to it's just given to you? Now, philosophically, you can kind of talk about if that's a good thing or not, but it was a really interesting take on what it means to be a contributing member to society from a civic perspective.
I want you to know that was deep on on that. I mean, that was deep. I love it.
I mean, at the end of the day, though, I really just want a USPSA division that allows me to shoot tactical nukes and flamethrowers.
And bugs.
Yeah.
And bugs.
The only good bug is a dead bug.
That's right.
That's right. That's what I say about snakes.
I will say that is one downside to the movie. I don't think it comes across as much as it does in the book about that. They talk about it in the beginning when he's in the classroom, and before Ratchak becomes Ratchak's Roughnecks or whatever. But
right,
like I do wish they had stressed that a little bit more in the movie, because that was something I thought was a lot more. It was explored a lot better in the book. But yeah, that was one of my favorite parts of the whole thing.
That's always kind of the challenge when you're adapting a book to a movie, is you're trying to take something that you can talk about in depth through the use of the English language, and now you're trying to translate into a more of a visual perspective. And so sometimes that's a little bit of a challenge. I mean, I totally understand their interpretation, kind of taking the idea of civic involvement and maybe painting it in a little bit of a darker light, with sort of the totalitarian aspect of mandatory civic service. It's in the interpretation. I mean, for me, I was just more disappointed in these guys were supposed to have power armor, and instead they look like a bunch of grunts, running across the field. I'm going, wait, they're not doing anything except getting eaten by bugs. No, this is not mobile infantry. Mobile infantry is power armor, rockets, nukes.
Yeah, if you've ever seen any of the follow-up movies to it, they're not as good, but they do have the power armor.
Well, small favors.
Yeah.
Wait, are these all direct to video, right?
Yeah.
Ooh,
yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Sharknado.
That's actually, I'm surprised because now Paramount
I don't want you to be disappointed.
So, well, maybe that'll be when I'm having trouble falling asleep.
Yeah,
Paramount just came out with their new one, Halo. So I don't know if you looked at that one or if you remember the game Halo with the Master Chief in it.
I do. I mean, my son actually brought that up on Halo, and of course, the challenge is, we don't have cable anymore, but now the downside is how many different streaming services do you need to be able to catch the one show that you're particularly interested in? I saw there's been a couple of Halo movies that were on Netflix. One was kind of an extended series talking about Halo Reach, which I thought was kind of that I actually really liked. So in that particular series, Master Chief plays just a very small role. They actually spend a little bit more time with the ship commander, if I remember correctly. So I kind of liked that sort of look into the character development of not everybody starts off as this really strong guy. I mean, to say like, hey, I'm not really quite sure about myself, and then the aliens show up, and you're like, oh well, I guess I have to be a leader now. I was most disappointed that he didn't get the girl. That was a little sad. I was like, oh, you finally got the girl. No, she's dead. All right, well, I guess we'll go fight some aliens and some crazy bugs. And that appears to be a common thread, right?
Yes, bugs. Yes, yeah. But the one on Paramount, I will have to say, I like the way they're actually doing this one. It seems like they're actually starting it from the beginning of how the Master Chief and his crew came about,
right?
And going forward from there. So there's only 3 episodes so far, so I have to give it a thumbs up so far.
It's a live action series?
Yes, it is.
Okay, that should actually be pretty interesting, because I think they did a couple of animated shorts on YouTube, sort of talking about Master Chief and the group of guys that he ran with, and so it's an interesting look into, okay, well, they're obviously Spartans other than Master Chief. What are those Spartans like? Just to go back to Halo Reach, that was also an interesting thing. So the guy gets rescued, and all the Spartans take off their helmets, and they're literally these cadets are looking at the Spartans going, you guys are our age, but you're big. I suppose that must be what it's like, when we shoot USPSA, you're like, oh, I'm really good. And then you hear some, Christian Seiler going up and just blasting things and like getting awesome scores. And you look at him, you go, you're, all right, I'm going home.
Yeah. Yep. I
Yeah,
quit.
for sure.
I'm out.
Demoralizing.
Yeah. So now, a second question for you is, who is your favorite superhero, or what? It could be what or who is your favorite superhero.
Favorite superhero, Batman. Batman is probably my favorite superhero because he's a superhero in theory, but he's the one that literally has no powers, right? All his skills and his powers are basically derived from his own genius and his ability to create tools to best meet the situation. Batman is probably the most complicated character in some ways, in terms of, there is a clear, hey, my parents were killed when I was younger, and I went on a soul searching mission and was inspired to fight crime. By the way, I happen to be a billionaire, but he's someone who is very, the different interpretations of Batman. He's very complicated. He demands justice, but he also demands very high standards for himself in terms of his obligations to society as Bruce Wayne, as well as his obligations to the city as Batman.
So, Yeemin, who's your favorite Batman actor wise?
Good question.
Tough one.
I'm not a huge Batman fan, but I've got my own favorite.
I like Christian Bale's interpretation as probably the most realistic of the
That's
Batman
what I like too.
and his character. But I also appreciate Michael Keaton because he was the first, and you're talking about a Batman series that sort of started in the late '80s and the early '90s. So you had obviously a very different acting presentation where there's a little bit of the dark side, but not overwhelmingly the dark side, because I think that's what people were looking for in the movies back then. So you could tell that he was very conflicted as Batman, but he wasn't necessarily as dark and conflicted as, say, Christian Bale's Batman.
Okay.
Well, here's a question then, spinning off of that. Then how do you were saying about how he holds himself to such a high standard and everything like that. But in I think it was the one with the Justice League anyway, it shows that Batman kills the Joker. So.
Right. Well, I mean, it's like anything else in comic books, right? So, my experience with Batman growing up was sort of the more traditional late 70s, early 80s Batman, where Batman never, he didn't use guns. He never really killed anybody. I think the first time I remember seeing Batman actually causing irreparable physical harm was when, I forget, he was the Dark Knight or something. He ended up breaking a character's back. And the challenge with comic books, like anything else, is you start off with a particular storyline, and then you generally end up retconning certain things to try to maintain interest. So that's always the challenge, right? I mean, it's the same thing with Superman. I mean, you're basically talking about a guy, okay, well, he can fly, he's super strong, he's invincible. Okay, we can only stretch this for so long. Then how do you go about, maintaining interest and coming up with new storylines? So then you come up with, the different the Marvel Cinematic Universe with the different dimensions. You start wandering into that, and certainly I think with Justice League, if I remember correctly, that was a very different take on the DC superheroes than in previous iterations. So it to a certain extent, it's about interpretation. You can maintain the general theme of superheroes as we remember them, while also making small adjustments to go, okay, well, now this Batman is slightly different. Again, what I remember watching the animated Batman series, and the animated Batman series was something that I thought was particularly interesting because it was a kids show, but it did a really interesting job of exploring somewhat more adult concepts, but couched in a way that the FCC censors wouldn't go, oh, this is an adult thing, bad cinematographer, or bad writers. So it's always going to be what you remember those superheroes based on the iteration that you read at the time. So I mean, can Batman be someone that is more darker, that is willing to actually use lethal force? Sure. You can always have that interpretation, and that's why you have Comic-Con and all these different events where people go, no, this Batman is the best Batman. No, this Batman is the best Batman, and it kind of keeps people focused on the characters in a way that continues to grow that particular character, the medium, or just interest in general.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right, man. So far, I am very much enjoying these answers. So we're doing pretty good. So we're gonna shift a little bit, going into the reason we have you. So a little bit more gun related. So your favorite gun and your favorite caliber. They do not have to, intersect, and it could be pistol, rifle, whatever. Grenade, tank.
My favorite gun. I think it's a toss-up between a Mark II 50 cal and the Gal 30, only because they're machine guns. Everybody loves machine guns. The 50 cal is quite iconic. It's very interesting to consider that the 50 cal was invented almost a century ago, and despite its age, it's a very functional and very effective platform. You've seen different contractors try to update the 50 cal in various methods, but it just works. It works. It consistently works. You headspace, you headspace, you time it, you throw in some 50 cal, and it's an immensely useful weapon for light anti-material applications. We've made it work as a sniper rifle in Vietnam, and it's just a lot of fun and has a very distinctive sound to it. Just push the butterfly triggers, and we've been able to make it work from as an original ground crew serve weapon to an aerial platform to just about anything else in the sun. And much like the 1911, it's a design that has really defied any real opportunity to replace it. Like, we've just never really been able to find anything that is more effective than a 50 cal as a general purpose medium to heavy machine gun. And then who doesn't like the Gal 30? I mean, literally, let's make the biggest gun possible and build an airframe around it. So what are we going to do with this? I don't know, but we're going to kill a lot of tanks with it. So that's kind of it. The Gal 30 was very purpose built in terms of anti-tank warfare, and it's also something that just has been able to defy any means of replacement. So I think a couple years ago, when they were thinking about phasing out the A-10s and realizing, there still is a purpose for there still is a mission for a purpose-built ground attack cannon that basically goes through anything and everything, and it also it's its own distinctive sound. When you're on the battlefield and you hear a Gal 30 go off, you're like, oh, somebody's having a really, really, really bad day. Like, I'm glad I'm not at the receiving end of that.
Or the pilot's having a really good day.
Right,
True.
exactly.
Well,
he's just living life to the fullest.
Well, as long as he understands, don't hold the trigger down too long, or the Earth realizes the A-10 is too ugly and it just falls.
Right. It's like, no, it's cool. Hey, that's a great way. That is the one time where you can say at my funeral, in my eulogy, he died doing what he loved.
This is true.
Slowing down so that his plane crashed.
Well, I'm sure he would be an example taught at the Air Force Academy. Okay, remember this guy. Don't do what he did.
Yeah.
Favorite caliber?
He died smiling, but he still died.
He definitely did. Favorite caliber? Man, you're actually making me think about this one.
I feel like we need to play the Jeopardy music.
Well, the caliber I obviously shoot.
I mean, what I will say is this: 9mm, I think, is the most chosen. though.
Yeah, it's probably the most popular.
Hmm. Well, let's think about something a little bit different then.
All right, while you're thinking, one, the 50 cal has, as the old saying goes, withstood the test of time, like the 1911 has. And two, the Gal 30, you put an anti-tank gun in a flying tank.
Oh, this is true.
Yeah.
This is true. Actually, let's go a little bit far back. What was the Mauser originally chambered in? It was 8 mm Mauser or 7 mm Mauser?
Yes.
Both.
I don't know. However, Google sometimes knows.
I would almost say the Mauser round is actually something that I would consider really interesting as a favorite round, because you're really talking about at that point you're talking about the first development of a working bolt action mechanism that allowed you to actually be able to shoot what caliber? 8. So yeah, so 8 mm Mauser. I mean, 8 mm Mauser is something that's been around. What there really hasn't been something that's been developed that's really greatly improved upon it. You know, that you can still see that functioning in hunting rifles all the way to the old Mauser rifles. If you look at the bolt action designs at the time, you look at the 1903 Remington. The 1903 Remington was essentially a variation of the Mauser action. So that particular bolt action, really look at as the first robust, combat effective bolt action mechanism, and it's been able to continue on, even in sporting purposes. And it's a very effective round. It does pretty much what you need it to do. For something that was designed definitely over 100 years ago, it's similar to like the 50 cal, where it's just been able to stand the test of time.
It's amazing how guns that were made in that era are still popular today in some ways.
Yep. Well, to be fair, it was probably a lot easier to actually manufacture stuff. I mean, if you happen to blow up a gun, you didn't have to end up spending millions of dollars in lawsuit fees, or be
This is
grilled on
true.
social media.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. One gun blowing up doesn't ruin your entire company.
It does not.
Yeah, 6 years later, they were like, "Do you remember that Carl, in Stuttgart where he blew his hands up? It's so sad. What happened? It's
They're
terrible.
like, oh, no, it happened,
Who's Carl? I thought his name was Klaus."
right?
All right, so you went into the Marine Corps right after college.
Yes, sir.
Obviously, you said you went overseas a couple times. So, what was your favorite moment, story, duty station, whatever, from your time in the Marine Corps?
Well, unfortunately, I was stationed in 29 Palms my entire career.
Oh, Lord.
But I volunteered. I actually volunteered to go to the division in 29 Palms. I think, like anybody else that joins the Marine Corps officer side, we sort of go, I want to be a combat arms guy. So I think the way that it works on the officer training side is you have a list of 32 MOSs at the time, and you ranked it from first to 32nd, and depending on how you perform at officer training, that determined your MOS choice. So I think I put tanks, infantry, a bunch of other combat stuff, communications, and then logistics was my 5th choice, because I just didn't know any better at the time. So when I was told that I was going to be logistics, I just figured, well, this is my introduction to the big green weenie, so you might as well give it to me with both barrels. I now volunteer to go to the division in 29 Palms.
Wow, you went for the biggest green weenie you could find.
I did. I didn't even say, well, maybe I could go to Hawaii or anywhere else. But surprisingly enough, 29 Palms, I actually really appreciated my time there. It was definitely an experience. I'm glad I went there when I was single. I showed up to 29 Palms in the dark and then woke up the next day and realized there was literally nothing around. But from a training perspective and a distance from the flagpole and being able to actually focus on your job and not necessarily have to deal with some of the other administrative aspects, that was something I really enjoyed. And to be perfectly honest, it did make it easier when I went to Iraq. Literally, I landed in Kuwait and looked around and thought, wow, this literally looks like March Air Reserve Base that I got on a plane 16 hours ago. Are you sure We're not back in California. No,
Time warp.
Yeah. So and even the 2 deployments to Iraq, those were. It's interesting how there are people I still talk to afterwards that say the happiest they were was when they were deployed, because there's just
Not at 29 bulbs.
well, there's a certain simplicity to being deployed, right? So you're not worrying about paying the bills. You're not worried about if your Marines are, paying 30% loans on a Mustang, getting tattoos, going to the strip joint and coming back the next day going, I love her, she loves me, like you just met her yesterday. There's just a certain simplicity where all you have to do is wake up, do your job, go to sleep, and even when things were less than stellar, there was a purity to it that it's really hard to explain. I think the closest I've been able to find that purity is skydiving. So when you're skydiving, so it's really interesting. Everybody thinks about skydiving, and Mike Shadowloff can totally talk to this because he's much more experienced in skydiving. People think about it I'm totally dating myself, because most people think about it from Point Break, right? The guys who are all like, oh, dude, blah, whatever, like very sort of chill. And the first time I went to go learn to skydive, it was really interesting the way that they were able to flip that switch. So you would talk to them and they would totally try to put you at ease, dude, bro, whatever. But then when it came time to just before you jump, it was like they flipped a switch and it was all serious. Okay, tell me what you're going to do. All right, well, I'm going to exit the plane. I'm going to achieve a stable flight platform. I'm going to ensure that I maintain a stable flight platform while constantly viewing my altimeter up until about an altitude of approximately 8,000 to 10,000 feet. Okay, what are you going to do after that? And it was very process-oriented, very serious, like, whoa, I thought skydiving was all about being chill. So, but when you're in the air and you're skydiving, in some ways, I'll occasionally find this when I shoot a USPSA stage. The only thing that you can really be aware of while you're skydiving is just what's going on around you, right? You can't really think like, oh, I wonder what's for dinner. I wonder how bad traffic's going to be on the 95. I wonder who.
Oh no, you're looking at the drop zone and which ways the wind come in and all of that.
Yeah, but it's a very singular focus.
Yes.
That is probably the closest thing I found to being deployed, where you really cannot take your attention away from the task at hand. So I actually really enjoyed my deployments, good, bad, and ugly. Though they were very different experiences from my first and second deployment. But there's just, there's those stories that, when were you in, Dave?
I'm dating myself now, and that would be 85 to 94.
So right before Desert Storm and then shortly afterwards. Yeah. So there are these things that happen when you're in the military service that it's really hard to convey the context to people that haven't served. People think about the military as this sort of large, gargantuan thing where everybody is the same and everybody does things a certain way, or they see what they watch in the movies and they think, oh, this is kind of the way military service is. And they're just, the experience is very different. It can be great, it can be terrible, but there are certain things that you experience where you just go, I don't really know how you could ever explain to somebody, yeah, we thought what is it? I've heard guys in Okinawa in the middle of a typhoon going, oh, well, what did you guys do in the typhoon? Well, sir, we decided to take our mattresses out, put on our flak and Kevlars, and see if we could parachute with our tarps from the third story. And you literally just look at them and go, I got nothing, because you don't even know what to say. But they did it. They were
right.
Just like, hey, if I make a parachute, will I be able to survive on a mattress in the middle of a typhoon?
Yep. Legit.
Yeah. So
Yep. Yeah, I was over there when we had a couple of them come through. We had the typhoon parties, people putting on their helmets and flag jackets going outside. Yep. It's
Mhm.
legit.
because I guess when you're young and you're invincible, you're like, well, I guess we might as well see what happens. Where were you at in Okinawa, sir?
Camp Schwab.
I'm so sorry.
Where were you at?
I never made it to Okinawa. I was actually going to
Okay.
be posting it, but when we were doing the UDP programs at the time, all the infantry battalions from 29 Palms were basically going to Camp Schwab. So I showed up right after our units returned from Camp Schwab, and so it's one of those interesting things where people will say, "Yeah, Camp Schwab is literally in the middle of nowhere," and at the same time, I've heard that it has some of the most gorgeous scuba diving out there. If you
Oh,
if
yeah.
you're interested.
Even if you were just going to go out and do snorkeling, I mean, it was fantastic.
Right.
So,
It's kind of it's kind of crazy because you think about it. There's really only the military out there, and it's generally very undisturbed.
yeah. I mean, I extended a second year there. I enjoyed it a lot. So
Okay.
it was fun. Saw a Habu mongoose fight just north of there and all kinds of good stuff. So,
I regret not having been to Okinawa. I've known some Marines who just absolutely despise being in Okinawa, and I've known folks who wanted to spend the rest of their lives there. So my best friend, one of my best friends in the Marine Corps, he and his family were stationed out there as a Cobra pilot, and his wife at the time she was born and raised Marine Corps. So her father was a retired colonel, and she just thought, wow, family in Okinawa. She was not really looking forward to it. And their experience was very much the opposite. She found that it was great for the kids. You could basically fly from Okinawa to pretty much anywhere in the Pacific very cheaply. So it was kind of amazing that they actually spent more time visiting Taiwan than I did. They were just constantly traveling all over the place, and they ended up realizing that it was a really great place to have a family.
I found that the northern training area, might be the darkest spot on Earth. You remember Silence of the Lambs when they showed the scene where she couldn't see anything, and she's like, "That was me one night, northern training area.
Wow.
I could not see the guy in front of me, and I was arm lengths away. So whenever we had to step over something, and we would break contact with this pack, I was like, oh, where'd he go? Where'd he go? It was that bad.
Wow.
It was nuts dark. I have never in my life experienced anything. I can go in a bathroom, shut all the lights off, and it's not as dark as that night was in that jungle.
Wow.
Yeah,
So
it was nuts.
the canopy is really that thick.
It is that thick in that area. And the crazy thing was, the slope was probably a good 30 or 40%.
Okay.
So, we were precariously walking with, our packs and doing it because it was a nighttime patrol. And that was crazy.
But you survived.
I did survive. I did not die. So I'm good.
That is actually why he's as short as he is, though. Having to lean back all the time. But it's okay.
All right. So moving along now. When did you first shoot a gun?
That is actually a really interesting story. So I was born and raised in Western Kentucky in a little town called Owensboro. And the first time I actually shot a gun was at a game warden's house. So I decided I wanted to learn how to shoot a gun. My family had no prior experience. And, being in the Midwest and the South, I thought, well, let me just call the police. So I called the Owensboro Police Department and said, hey, my name's Yeemin. I'd really like to learn how to shoot a gun. Where do I go about doing this? And of course, it's a relatively small town, so people aren't going. Now, these days, you do that, and they're probably going to show up at your house. But they were kind enough to actually connect me with the local game warden. So again, it's something that I really found welcoming about the Second Amendment community is I call up this game warden out of the blue, and he doesn't even say, hey, let's go to the range and let me vet you or anything. He literally said, well, come by my house. And I'm like, I drive to this guy's house, and he was just so welcoming. He was so friendly. He literally brought out everything from his safe. So we started with everything from a 22 to a 9mm to a 357, a shotgun, a rifle, and in Kentucky, you basically build up a berm in your backyard in the country, and you basically have a range. So we went out there, and he literally was kind enough to kind of walk me through all the appropriate safety steps, and literally let me shoot, anything, almost everything he dragged out of his safe. And it was really cool because he was so friendly and so open about it. And it turned out he was actually serving in the National Guard as a sniper, so he had been deployed to Yugoslavia for the police action there. And so it was definitely a really interesting first experience, something that I feel like we don't necessarily, sometimes we need to spend more time showing that the Second Amendment is generally very friendly. I mean, very similar to USPSA. You show up to match your gun breaks or your mags break or something, and people literally start digging into their car going like, hey, I have all this stuff for you. If you don't have ammo, like, hey, I've got ammo for you to shoot. And so that sort of welcoming introduction into firearms was something that was really special to me.
Wow. How old were you when you did that?
I think I was still in college or just before.
Okay.
It might have been just after. But it was fairly late on. So I did not grow up with, an extensive firearms background. Most of it was from military history. I'm a military history buff. So my mom would, my mom tells me when I was in kindergarten and I go into the library and the first book I pick up is a book about World War I. And she's like, yeah. And so that's always been something that's just been very fascinating to me is military history, and particularly all the guns and tools and stuff.
Okay, Leo.
Now, I would like to put something out. I looked it up. As of 2019, there were less than 60,000 people in Owensboro, Kentucky. So back then, there were probably 12. So it's easy to know the game warden, when there's only 13 people in your town.
This is true. To be perfectly honest, I wasn't involved in that. So it's very interesting in being in Western Kentucky and, not being exposed to guns at all other than what I've read in the history books. And I just didn't know. I literally was, well, I guess if I want to learn how to shoot guns, maybe I should ask the police.
Where did you go to college?
I mean, that's the way to go, though.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is. Yeah. I mean, they did exactly what they needed to do from a public service perspective, after that little bit of hesitation of, here, why don't you talk to the game warden? So, so the question, Dave, was where I went to school.
Yeah. Where'd you go to school?
I went to some school in Connecticut.
So, okay. So that, okay.
I apologize.
You don't have to name it. That's
no,
fine.
no. I apologize. I'm always a little bit more demure about it. I went to Yale University.
Okay. So that. What's up, Leo?
I went to Yale.
Oh, okay. Smart guy.
My brother goes to Yale online. So
that's
online.
a true story.
No,
he harasses
it's
him all
funny.
the time.
His wife sent me a picture of him in front of the medical building, and I'm like, Photoshop? No, don't believe it.
Nice. Well, so I mean, is he actually there right now, or?
You'd be proud of that. No, he's here. So it's to be a PA. He's doing it through the Air Force. So part of it, he goes up there to do his practicals. So yes, he goes to Yale, whatever. So, but be proud. You can be proud. That's a good school, I hear.
For the record, I taught him to be a paramedic. So there we go. That's how he got into Yale.
You taught my brother. Yeah, that's how he got into Yale. It was Dave was like, "This is how you do it, dummy."
This is how you do it.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's very interesting that Yale and the Marine Corps are actually a little bit more linked than I expected. So when I applied to Yale, the Ivy Leagues basically all give applicants the opportunity to interview with an alumni. It's kind of a brand ambassador thing because the alumni usually can present the school in sort of the best light. And so the person I interviewed with for Yale, he was actually part of the church that my parents went to. So they went to a Presbyterian church. And it turned out he was actually in the Marine Corps. So it's very interesting that back in the 50s there was a non-insignificant number of people who would join the Marine Corps, go to Yale or go to the Ivy Leagues, and afterwards they would serve in the military. So he was actually a combat engineer in the Marine Corps in the 50s. And it turned out that his classmate was actually Pete Wilson, the governor of California. So that was really interesting because I worked the alumni visits for 1 year, and so I'm talking with the guy that interviewed me. We turned out to be very good friends, and he was like, "Oh, by the way, this is Pete Wilson." I'm like, "Wow, you're famous." So it was actually really interesting. So I had such a really good impression of my interviewer as someone who grew up in Maine, sort of, and went to Yale, and then after Yale joined the Marine Corps, and then somehow ended up in Owensboro, Kentucky, of all places. So it was really interesting. The recruiting station, the officer recruiting station for Yale, surprisingly enough, was actually out of Manhattan. So it was different, because I went down there, and then 9/11 happened and all the stuff that came out of that. But the Marine Corps actually had a fairly regular presence at Yale. The officer guys would come up every couple of months and just set up, and and now they have Navy ROTC down there. So it's very interesting when you look back historically that the Ivy Leagues, let's go back to Robert Heinlein and Starship Troopers. So you go back far enough into the 40s and 50s, and you look at the Ivy Leagues as, yes, we are the sort of the ivory tower, but there is a sense of civic responsibility that's associated with that. So, back in the 40s and 50s, and maybe up to the 60s to a certain extent, there wasn't this stigma of, oh, you went to an Ivy League school and now you're joining the military. It was sort of considered, hey, this is the responsibility we have to basically give back to the country in some form or fashion.
Well, that's interesting you say it, because I wrote down one of the notes was I was like, that's interesting to me because I would see Yale as being a very liberal school and maybe not quite so military friendly, but it sounds like it's exactly the opposite.
Well, now, I mean, clearly, there's a little bit of a change in that, but I certainly wasn't the only person from Yale to actually go to the Marine Corps. Out of the officer community, one of the guys in my officer class that was 2 years before me, he decided to go through the enlisted route as a reservist before he joined as an officer. Again, we're all fairly well versed in sort of military history and sort of the history of the military in general, and so that was a concern on his part. If you look at the 70s and 80s, where there was a disconnect between the officer corps and the enlisted, sort of the haves and the have-nots, and he felt that he needed to experience the military as an enlisted before being put in a position of leadership. There were actually a number of people. One of my other best friend, who's in the military medical community now at the Army, he was from Cornell, and so it was actually quite surprising to find that there were actually, I mean, we're not talking significant numbers, but there were definitely people out of the Ivy League who felt that military service was an acceptable path.
That's awesome. That's real good.
And that was, I mean, so much in World War II, most of the OSS, which then eventually became the CIA, was recruited from the Ivy League when they were still under the Department of Defense. So, I mean, it makes sense, but obviously, like you said, there's been a shift, but historically that has been the case. So it is pretty interesting that a lot of people don't like. I until we had this conversation, I hadn't really thought about it until looking back and being like, oh well, that is So
yeah, I mean, my senior class thesis was actually on military manpower staffing. So there was actually a guy who, and I'm really sorry that I can't remember his name right now, but he was a former NSA director, and he actually taught a senior seminar, and it was about American national security policy. And that was really cool because you just, you really got to hear it from somebody who had sort of seen not only from the military side, but also from a real politics side. If I remember correctly, David Petraeus, after he left the Army, actually was. He actually taught a seminar at Yale too as an adjunct professor. So there is definitely, it has its up and downs. I mean, my favorite professor is She was a military history professor. Now she's with John Hopkins Kennedy, or no, she's now at Johns Hopkins at their School of Advanced International Studies, and like she was so super amazing. And I know I'm going to remember her name at some point. I mean, she spoke fluent Russian. Her senior thesis was actually on Soviet and German military tank doctrine between the two world wars. And when I read that, I was like, this is so super cool. She actually was able to. Oh, Mary Haybeck. Mary Haybeck. Yeah, so she's at, as last I checked, she's still at Johns Hopkins. And when the Cold War ended, she was actually able to get into the now former Soviet Union, and was able to come back, with just a pile of original documentation, just about the various military things at the time. And so, there are definitely pockets of that, and it just comes and goes. But yeah, that was super cool. Yeah, I love that class.
That's pretty wild. So, what was it? The military, just your interest in the military history then that drove you to join the Marine Corps?
I will be perfectly honest. The reason why I joined the Marine Corps is because after 22 years of school, I did not want to go to investment banking or consulting like the vast majority of my classmates. And so that was sort of the accepted path, not accepted, but it's kind of where people went. They would go work for a consulting firm or investment banking firm in New York for about 4 years and then go to grad school. I definitely did not want to go back to grad school because I was tired of class, and I didn't really know what else I wanted to do for work. So I will be perfectly honest. I was the equivalent of a 22-year-old Lance Corporal not knowing what he wanted to do with his life. So I thought, well, I'll join the Marine Corps instead. This will be great. I'll get some life experience, and then maybe I'll go back to grad school. And then 9/11 happened, and I was like, well, I guess now I'm actually going to live something that will be written about in the history books. Hooray.
There you go. So I take it you enjoyed your time though, and
it was more good than bad. I think anybody who kind of went through the beginning of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, I was there in the beginning, so in Iraq where it sort of felt like going to the Super Bowl. I mean, I don't really think that. I think that's the most relevant context. We'd sort of been training, and then you went there and you sort of thought, okay, now we finally actually got to do what we did, and things weren't particularly terrible, and we came back and everybody thought, this is great. We sort of achieved the highest point in our lives, and then the Marine Corps said, hey, you're going back to Iraq in 6 months, and we went, what? And the second deployment was a little bit more challenging. The environment was certainly different. It was a more kinetic environment. There were some challenges there, and my buddy who was a Cobra pilot, he went on back-to-back tours until I think 2007, and so I never really made the transition to, let's say, if you talk to John Browning with AMU. John Browning was with 3-5 when they had a very difficult deployment in Sangin, and John's such a great guy. He's been able to handle that in a very in a great manner, right? He doesn't necessarily get that look of like, oh yeah, that was a really bad time. I mean, and you don't really need to ask him. You understand. But I was never really involved in that type of environment where everything was just rough. Even with the second deployment, with the casualties that we took and the different things that we encountered on the Iraqi-Syrian border, I guess I don't know. Just what is it we say? Better lucky than good, right? So.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt, that's for sure. But I agree with you on the Super Bowl thing, because that's the one thing. While I'd been around the world training and doing a bunch of different things, training with a bunch of different military and all of that. Even when I was in, I was okay with going to combat, because while you can train and test yourself and do whatever you want to do, there's only one real test. And that's it. So it never happened during my time, but it is what it is. So I totally get the Super Bowl analogy, because that's exactly what it is. That's the one and only true test, and that is the Super Bowl of the military. So
yeah, and then well, at least until you're like, wow, this was great, and then wait a minute, the Super Bowl goes for how many years?
Right.
Oh,
The never-ending Super Bowl.
the
It's like
never-ending Super Bowl,
4,000 quarters of football.
right?
It's like tag team because you got to tag the next one in.
Pretty much.
So to close down that chapter, when did you decide to get out?
2005. So it would have been after my second deployment. At that time, I had the opportunity to do another fleet tour as a company commander in Okinawa, and just at that time, I felt like it was time to go. It was
Okay.
time.
Okay. So you got out, transitioned, and so how did you go from Kentucky to Connecticut to now you're in California?
Yes.
So how does that, what made you decide when you got out that you were going to stay in California?
Well, my sister at the time was in the San Francisco Bay Area. She was still going to, she was living up there. And I fully admit, being 25, 26, okay, now I'm not
Still not knowing what you were going to do. Yeah.
I was not a lost I was not a lost lance corporal, but I was probably an equally lost corporal / sergeant at that point. And I knew I didn't want to go back to Kentucky. And my sister was in California, so I figured, well, I'll stay in California.
Okay. All right. How are you enjoying California? You've been there for a couple of days now.
Just a few. California is there's so many things that I love about the state of California. California, you literally can choose to see 4 seasons if you want to. Everything's generally within driving distance. So if you want to go see snow, if you want to go to the mountains, that's about 2-3 hours away. If you want to go see the ocean, that's about an hour away. If you want to see, actual seasons, trees, and so forth, everything's generally within driving distance. The variety of foods and people, and quite frankly, the weather is generally very pleasant. We normally start crying when it gets above 70 degrees, and we also start crying when it gets below 50. And it's kind of depressing to say that, because having been in Northern Virginia before, we know that variation is significantly larger. And at the same time, you can be very frustrated with the political climate. You can be very frustrated with the taxes and the cost of living. These are all very real, tangible things that it can be very difficult to ignore after a while. But from a USPSA perspective, California is actually amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Whether you're in the San Francisco Bay Area or you're down in the LA area, they're very strong, robust clubs down there. There's a very strong USPSA presence, very mature presence. And so I was actually really surprised to see just how strong the competitive shooting community was in California. And not only how strong the competitive shooting community is, but just also how diverse it is. We would have guys we had guys that shot the match that were Google employees, they were YouTube employees, we had doctors, we had lawyers. Believe it or not, the former president of CrossFit, Dave Castro would come shoot our matches. And you're like, wow, hey, you're the president of CrossFit now. And so, you get a really wide variety of folks that come and enjoy the matches, come and enjoy each other's company, and then they're able to kind of take that message and continue on with their involvement in the competitive sports after that. And the other interesting thing about California is, we're kind of the whipping boy for, the red part of the country. And, the reality is a little bit more nuanced than that. Yes, we have a lot of laws. And something that was very interesting for me to observe is that the Western United States has always had a little bit more of a live and let live, very independent minded. So it's actually really interesting that the reality is we have a lot of laws, but then the adherence or the enforcement of those laws is not as stringent as, say, New York. So I remember the first time I went to Area 8, And I saw all the guys from Long Island and New York, and we're sitting there talking about how the environment is. And I basically told them, yeah, we still shoot all the divisions. We don't shoot to 10 rounds. And they looked at me and thought, well, that's some horse dung right there. Like, because, New York, if you have anything over 10 rounds, it's do not pass go to jail, forever. Whereas here, it's like, okay, well, if you're not committing a heinous crime, and more often than not, it will be, overlooked.
Yeah, I mean, when we had Juanzik on and he talked about being at the airport in New York and a cop pointing an automatic weapon at him, because he had guns and magazines that weren't allowed in that state. I was like, holy cow, there's a little bit of pucker factor.
Yeah, and it's always very interesting for people coming to California for the first time, and they ask, what is the likelihood? And unlike the New York airports, where the New York Port Authority is the law enforcement that actively look for that, you fly out of California and TSA goes, well, TSA doesn't enforce California state laws. It's sort of the same thing I experienced when I flew out of Area 8 the last time I flew out of Reagan National, and I was, a little bit like, okay, I'm in DC now. Like, what happened?
Right.
And I was, and I was very surprised to find that they were very much TSA as well. I mean, look, we've all been there where, you get ready to fly out for a match and you think you've checked your bags, and then you realize you haven't. And so I had these Remington primers right before they went bankrupt. I thought, wow, I am totally set for primers for the next couple of years. And then I realized, wait a minute, there's a reason why they went bankrupt. These primers were so bad, I think I had like an 80% fire rate with a stock weapon, right? Just whatever it was. And so I kept those as my dry fire ammo, and of course I forgot, and they were loose, and yeah. But it was again, the experience was very amazing to me, because it was, the TSA supervisor comes up and he goes, well, do you have a mag you can put these in? I'm like, yes, I have a mag. Hold on, put the dummy rounds in the mag, put it back in the carrying case, and I'm like, okay, thanks, have a nice day. But the experience coming into California is, very different than what I think it's very different than what you might see in the media. So
now they are, though, trying to pass more laws, I know, and we don't have to get into all of that. But does it look like any of the new stuff they're trying to pass will negatively affect your ability to shoot matches?
Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, we sort of go through this on an every year basis. So the interesting thing about California state law is that laws can be proposed. You can actually have laws that are set aside, and then they'll say, okay, now we're changing the name of this law to something else, and now we're reproposing this. So on an annual basis, there's almost always something that gets brought up, and there is a little bit of a feeling like you're an abused domestic violence survivor, because it's sort of, okay, well, this didn't pass, thank goodness, we're still going to keep what we have. But then at the same time, we had the mag ban that was passed. We were very concerned about that from a division perspective, and then the law was put on hold, and then it got taken to federal court. And so even though that law technically still exists, it stayed until it's decided by the circuit court or decided by the Supreme Court. So there is obviously that concern. Again, it's one of those, because California has a supermajority Democratic Assembly and Senate. There's a lot of behind the scenes politicking that has to take place, so that you either mitigate the impact or you essentially make an offer that they can't refuse, in terms of, yeah, this is really not a good idea, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So for better or for worse, we're all quite interested in seeing what the results of the New York case will be at the Supreme Court, in terms of whether they come out and say, hey, you actually need to apply strict scrutiny, or at a minimum, there needs to be some level of scrutiny and not just common good, which I believe that's what the standard is for most state Second Amendment laws at the moment.
Until next time.
Don't be a little bitch.
Yeah.